In the Southeast Asia region, quite a lot of games are released with English language options, and one company in particular releases nearly every one of their games with English language options. Why is this something that you might be interested in? Well, of course, sometimes games aren't released in Western territories, or perhaps there might be regional differences that might make you interested in another region's version. And this is also something that isn't very often discussed or widely known, and so I think it's something that you might want to keep in mind. Now, the company in question is Bandai Namco. Bandai Namco is now actually the third largest game company in Japan in terms of revenue and market capitalization, only behind Sony and Nintendo. However, they don't only just have a very big presence over in Japan, but also Southeast Asia. Their Southeast Asian branch is based out of Singapore, and as you can see, for instance, by checking their Twitter account, everything is in English. Now, an interesting thing about the Southeast Asia region, and this is of course countries such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, and many others, is that it's also one of the most linguistically diverse regions in the world. There are many different languages that these countries use. However, proficiency in English is also very high and is used for things like business. Now, when a company wants to release a game in the Southeast Asia region, it would of course be quite an issue to try and include every language that these countries speak. And so publishers will often decide to release their games in English in this region instead, as a sort of one-size-fits-all solution. Now, Bandai Namco is of course involved in many very big and popular Japanese franchises, such as Tekken, Pac-Man, Dragon Ball, Dark Souls, and many more. But again, more specifically, why might you be interested in this? Well, again, there's a bunch of games that are released in this region that aren't released westward. First though, it's worth pointing out some of the reasons why games may be released in regions such as Japan and Asia, but not the West. I mean, if the English localization work is already done, why don't the companies then release them in the US and Europe as well? However, some of the reasons for this can be things like licensing and brand deals. Sometimes a company's licensing agreements will stipulate that things such as voice work, music, or use of IPs can only be for a certain region. This is also one of the reasons why sometimes when games are released in the West, despite fans wanting dual audio, that isn't always possible to include in the Western releases. And then of course another reason is time and cost. For instance, when it comes to the production and marketing and so on and so forth. But back to the Asia exclusives, there's quite a lot of games released in the Asia region that aren't released westward. But to stick with just the Bandai exclusives and some recent games released, there's quite a lot of games based off anime franchises such as Full Metal Panic: Fight Who Dares Wins. This is a game based on the Full Metal Panic universe and is a strategy game with visual novel elements, and it was released in 2018 for the PS4, and of course now that all modern consoles are region free, that means you can get games from other regions and be able to play them on your Western systems. Another recent anime license that was an exclusive in Asia is Girls und Panzer Dream Tank Match, set in the Girls und Panzer universe. This is a tank battle game and is available for PS4 and Switch. There's also Jitama Rumble for the PS4, which is a hack and slash video game based on the Jitama anime series. But some other games include the PlayStation VR title Summer Lesson. This game is created by the creator of the Tekken series and is a VR title which involves you teaching students. Again, this game, as well as all other ones mentioned, are released in the Asia region, translated into English. Another game is Ace Angler, which is actually a very successful and popular Japanese arcade game, and the Nintendo Switch release was released in Asia with full English language support. And for instance, if you check the Japanese reviews on sites like Amazon, you'll see that this game is extremely popular. Some other games include many games in the Kamen Rider series. Kamen Rider is a big Japanese franchise, and many of the games aren't released westward, but in the Asia region, most games are released with English language support. For instance, the latest game in the series, Memory of Heroes, which was released for the PS4 and Nintendo Switch and is an action-adventure game. Some other big franchises that are often released in the Asia region with English language support but aren't often released in the West are the Gundam series as well as Super Robot Wars. The Gundam games are of course based on the Gundam franchise, while Super Robot Wars is also based on the Gundam franchise but is also notable in the fact it fuses lots of different franchises together. Of course, what that means is, like we discussed earlier when it comes to contracts and licensing deals and things, is that because it involves lots of different franchises, it's much harder to then have a contract that will allow them to take the product and release it in lots of different regions. And so of course the Asia region is something you might want to keep in mind, as most of these games are released in the Asia region fully in English. And another thing that you might want to keep in mind that isn't very often discussed is that the Asia region can have other bonuses as well. For example, this isn't a Bandai Namco title, but for Final Fantasy X and X-2, the Asia region released a game with both titles on the cartridge. Whilst over in the West, West, only Final Fantasy X was contained on the cartridge, and Final Fantasy X-2 was a downloadable code. And this is a trend that you can find a lot in Asia, with games being released physically that are digital only in the West. For instance, keeping with the Final Fantasy theme, the recent release of Final Fantasy IX for the Nintendo Switch, for example, is only digital only in the West, whilst the Asia release is fully in English and you can pick it up physically. There's a few different reasons why physical releases are much more common in Asia. One of these is that consumers buying physical releases is just much more popular over in Asia than the West, and so publishers take a look at the data and think it's more worthwhile to release games physically in Asia than westward. Also, in quite a lot of Asia regions, especially in more rural areas, home internet connectivity is much more limited, which is of course another factor. Now, if you're interested in checking out any of the games mentioned or any other Asian region games, how would you go about doing this? Well, here we're going to have to give a shout out to one of Censored Gaming's longest and most loyal sponsors. PlayAsia has been in business for 18 years now and is the biggest import specialist in the world. Based out of Hong Kong, they specialize in providing gamers all around the world with a whole range of Japanese and Asian products. And of course, like we mentioned earlier, now that nowadays all modern consoles are region free, that means you can pick games up from Japan and Asia and have them work on your Western systems. Due to being one of Censored Gaming's sponsors, you can also use the discount code Censored at checkout and get 5% off every order. And so that's something you definitely might want to keep in mind, and there'll be store links to all of the games mentioned in this video in the description. Alongside that, you can also of course pick up games digitally too. Now, picking up Asian digital games is something that people occasionally ask about, wondering how to go about doing this. Now, for Asia digital games, I'd recommend the Singapore region. The reason for this is that the Singapore storefronts are in English, which means navigating them is very easy. Also, they should have most Asian English games. For instance, like we mentioned earlier, Bandai Namco Asia is also based out of Singapore, for instance. Now, all you have to do is create an account for the Singapore region on platforms like the PlayStation Store, and then pick up a Singapore gift card. And it's here where PlayAsia again comes in very helpful, as they stock gift cards from all around the world. Again, you'll be able to find a link to their gift cards in the description, and if you have any other questions or thoughts, let us know in the comments below. What do you think about Asian English releases? As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and until next time, thank you for watching.